the most important thing from my point of view is that someone out there has now decided that core economic infrastructure is a viable target. And while it's not hard if you know what you're doing to get down the Nord Stream to poke a hole in it, there's a lot of infrastructure elsewhere, land pipelines, for example, that are far more vulnerable. And if the gloves are really coming off in this conflict, the economic damage we've seen to Europe to this point is only just now beginning. It is the 27th of September, and in the last 2 or 3 days, there have been a number of instances in the Baltic Sea that have caused damage to the Nord Stream pipeline system. There are 4 trunk lines, 2 part of Nord Stream 1 that have been operational for years, and 2 part of Nord Stream 2, who were finished about a year ago but haven't come online yet, that have now been damaged by unknown forces. The damage is in 70 meters of water, so about 220 feet. And the problem here is narrowing down the suspect pool is impossible. Because at that depth, if you have a couple of tanks and you know what you're doing, pretty much any commercial scuba diving operator could have gotten down that deep and, basically taken a pickaxe to a pipeliner. So the suspect pool, not at all. There are a number of theories out there, none of which I can put my finger on because none of them really make great sense. One is that the U.S. would do this in order to make sure the Europeans would never use Russian natural gas again. Okay, but the Russians turned off the pipes themselves, which is a much better PR battle from the American point of view than putting a couple of holes in a pipe which could be repaired. Some say this was the Ukrainians. That makes a degree of sense. However, the Ukrainians have natural gas pipes that are still operating that flow through the war zones and Ukrainian territory onto Europe, and it would be easier just to take out those. The Germans, probably not. They're the ones who are desperate for the gas. I think it might be interesting to point the finger at a number of the Nordic states, whether it's Sweden, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, or maybe even Poland, because they have a vested interest in seeing this line go offline because it would force the rest of the Europeans to finally suck it up and move on without Russia. That makes a little bit more sense. But again, this is relatively easily repairable unless the pipeline is like how to stick a dynamite put inside of it as opposed to someone just poking a hole at it. So no good theories hold up to any sort of scrutiny. Now, the pipelines were all off. Nord Stream 2 has never been turned on. Nord Stream 1, the Russians turned off 2 weeks ago in order to punish the Europeans. So it's not like there's any immediate danger here aside from simply a methane leak into the atmosphere, which is, in general, no bueno. The most important thing from my point of view is that someone out there has now decided that core economic infrastructure is a viable target. And while it's not hard if you know what you're doing to get down the Nord Stream to poke a hole in it, there's a lot of infrastructure elsewhere, land pipelines, for example, that are far more vulnerable. And if the gloves are really coming off in this conflict, the economic damage we've seen to Europe to this point is only just now beginning. And gas flows through a pipeline called Nord Stream. It's a subsea pipeline that goes directly from Russia to Germany. It's one of the few pieces of infrastructure that is not in immediate danger from the Ukraine war, all these pipes that cross Ukraine and Belarus from Russia to the European system, at some point over the course of this next year, probably within the next few months, they're all going to be shut down because of war damage, whether that is because the Ukrainians shut them down themselves or because of the Russians accidentally hitting their own infrastructure is kind of irrelevant at this point. It's kind of baked in as a 100% chance, really. There's no way that it's going to last. That leaves things like Nord Stream as the only remaining links. And the Germans worked with the Russians over the last 20 years to build the Nord Stream system to give them some insulation from things like what's going on in Ukraine now. And it has not worked. It has simply made the Germans horrendously dependent. Now, there are 4 things that the Germans rely upon to be the economic powerhouse that they are. The first are those natural gas flows. With the shutdown of Nord Stream, which is ostensibly for maintenance, is what the Russians are saying. In theory, they'll be back online on the 21st, but the Germans are being blackmailed by the Russians to back out of the coalition that is supporting Ukraine. Nord Stream is the most effective tool that the Russians have to do this. The quid pro quo is pretty straightforward. You stop providing logistical and political and military support for the Ukrainians, or we turn off the gas and never turn it back on. That would generate industry-wide shortages and shortages in heating system, and there is absolutely no way that the Germans would be able to maintain their economic model. It is based on access to large volumes of cheap Russian energy, both in terms of for electricity and as industrial inputs to power the entire German manufacturing model. So that all by itself could kill the German system almost within a year. But all of the other things that allow the Germans to be successful are in danger too. The Germans rely on a large, robust, highly skilled workforce, but Germany has one of the fastest aging societies in the world. Until now, that's worked for them. Because if you have a lot of people in their late 40s to early 60s, decades of experience, and none of them have kids, well, they can spend all their time working, and the state can spend all of their efforts on educating them to make them the most highly value-added workers in the world. But it's a bit of a starvation diet, because eventually people who are in their 40s to 60s become in their 60s to 70s, and that's where Germany almost is now. Germany will hit mass retirement this decade, and so the model was always in danger on demographic grounds. The third thing that allows the Germans to be who they are is access to Central European labor, all the way from Poland to Romania and even further east. Whenever you're doing manufacturing, not all of the jobs are high-skilled. Some are mid-skilled, some are low-skilled. The person who's bending the metal for a fender is probably not the person who's doing the spark plugs or the transmissions. And to have a successful manufacturing system in a globalized world, you need a differentiated workforce, different skill sets, different price points. And in Central Europe, the Germans have all that. They've had all that since the 1990s, but that's going away too, because just as the Germans are rapidly aging, the Central Europeans are aging even more rapidly. They're still on average a few years younger. They won't hit that mass retirement to the latter half of this decade or the first half of the 2030s. But the replacement population, the birth rate, in all of these countries is actually lower than it is in Germany. So it's every bit as terminal. And then fourth, you need access to the global system, especially when you have an aged demography without a lot of 20 and 30 somethings. The way you make it work is you sell products abroad. But the Americans have lost interest in that. The Americans created globalization as a bribe to fight the Cold War. We will enable everyone to trade with anyone and sell into any market if you side with us on security policies. But the US has been backing away from that for some time. And even in this reinvigoration of the Western alliance and NATO and the Western relations in general, that the Russian attack on Ukraine has caused, the Biden administration has not even floated the idea of a broad-scale regeneration of the old Cold War structures of trading economic access for security agreements. There's just a security deal in place here, which means that when the Ukraine war ends, as all wars eventually do, we go back to where we were, where the Americans basically go their own way. All of this put together suggests that the manufacturing model that has sustained Germany, that has provided the tax base, that has provided economic growth, that has made the population relatively happy with their situation, it's gone. And it's going to vanish within the next year. And a Europe that does not have a German motor at its heart is a Europe that all of a sudden needs to find a very, very different way to function. Now, that can take us down any number of rabbit holes, but we're going to have to hold off on that for another day.